However, I'm here to talk about public policy. And how do we go about thinking how this might apply to the wider society that has clearly got itself into a huge mess with debt and non-relational finance? First of all, it is a legitimate question to say, does this apply at all? Because as we've discussed, there is an exception in the law to the prohibition of interest and debt cancellation. Israelites were not required to lend interest-free to foreigners, those outside the national community, those who they didn't count as neighbours. And therefore it's not, I think, the moral equivalent. Charging interest is not theft. Augustine said it was, but I don't think so, partly because of the voluntarism involved, but also because I don't think God would enshrine this institution if it was the equivalent of theft in the law. So then, thinking about this, how does Jesus approach this question? And we've touched on this in the first half. Does he say to his disciples, well, the law in wider society, interest-free lending, was enough, maybe too idealistic, all you need to do is that? No. He took that, he assumed that for wider society, and then said the church, his disciples, had to go beyond that, lend without expectation of return. So, just thinking about personal application, it's very clear, if you're doubting this, you lend interest-free to those you count as neighbour. And Jesus says, answer the question, who is my neighbour? And he answered it expansively. Whoever you are dealing with, whoever you come into contact with, is your neighbour as a Christian. But then I'd say that he's resting on the law as how society, wider society in Israel, should have been regulated. Then moving on, what does thinking about this relationally imply? As we said, referred to in the parable of the 10 minas, Luke 19, it is, interest is reaping where you haven't sown. It's what hard men do. And the church critique of interest has traditionally ultimately come down to the question of risk of ownership. In a loan, the risk of the use of the money transfers to the borrower. They have an obligation to pay it back, but effectively the lender has transferred ownership, and the borrower can effectively do what they like. They've incurred the risk and they've got the obligation to repay. To take interest on that is the equivalent of trying to rent a loaf of bread. If I give you a loaf of bread, its use inherently destroys it. You eat it. You can't rent it. Ownership is gone. And so, in a loan, the risk is transferred. There's no, in modern parlance, added value from the lender. This is why it's different from investing in a business or renting property. The risk stays with the owner of the capital. And essentially they're getting a return in reward for that risk, so long as it's fair. Then I'd argue that the next point, what does embodying the gospel in wider social structures look like? From a Christian perspective, we ought to be always thinking, how is the law pointing to Christ? Because 2 or 3 times Jesus says he fulfills the law. The law and the prophets all point to him. And so from a Christian perspective, one of the things we ought to be looking for is ways in which we can embody the gospel in social structure. This is a very strange thing to do, but it's a reverse engineering your evangelism. It's saying it's difficult to understand the gospel, debt cancellation, redemption, if you haven't got these institutions in wider society. I'll finish with that point a bit more fully soon. But the final point is the pragmatic one. Does our current setup actually work? I think we're finding that it doesn't. There's a book on your reading list by Reinhardt and Rogoff called This Time It's Different, where they go through 800 years of financial crises. And essentially, each time you get a credit bubble or over-borrowing justified on something has changed, supposedly changed, about ability of borrowers and debtors to repay. And each time our optimism gets the better of us, and there's then a crash and instability. Humans are prone in this context to assume about the future that we will be able to repay it. We can manage this debt load. House prices won't fall. Unemployment won't rise. And each time we get it wrong. Now sometimes it takes 30 years ago, 40 years between those periods of exuberance and then crash. Sometimes it takes only 5 years. But the system, because it's based on debt, has this inherent tendency within it. And I'm just going to go on to that a little more in a moment. But if you don't want to take what the Old Testament says about this seriously, I'm going to argue that from a Christian perspective, you haven't got any alternative but the current system. You can say, wouldn't it be a good thing if we had a cap on interest rates, maximum interest rates? And the general Christian presumption has been a usury law is a maximum interest rate, stops exploitation. But actually that just sends lending to the poor underground and makes it even nastier when moneylenders collect. I'm also going to say that if you think that the conventional system can work, you're effectively putting your trust in bankers to behave themselves and act ethically, regulators to know enough about what bankers are doing, not going to happen, and about politicians not wanting to borrow too much against the future or to inculcate cheap credit because that's a good thing to buy votes. These are utopian expectations.